Bom dia. Thank you for being here. My name is Robert Talbert, and I'm a professor of mathematics and a presidential fellow for the advancement of learning at Grand Valley State University. Grand Valley State is a university of around 23,000 students located in the state of Michigan in the United States, and I'm really pleased to be speaking with you today at this important conference about this important topic. In March 2020, I came to Brazil for the first time to spend a week at Universidade de São Paulo working with Escola Politecnica, the engineering college of that university. The university had brought me in to explore the idea of redesigning its engineering curriculum around active learning and flipped instruction. At that time, USP and Pauli specifically were encountering some new realities about how their curriculum fit, or rather did not fit, with their students. The students were primarily in large lecture-focused courses with little active engagement. So those courses were primarily focused on the transmission of information, with applications left up to students in their own personal time as homework or projects. However, students were busier than ever in their personal time, holding down multiple jobs, taking care of family, and more. So attendance was low because why would you come to campus via a 2-hour metro ride when you could just get the same information off of YouTube and then show up for exams? Pauli knew at that time that the way that education had worked for them in the past was not going to continue working in the future. Students needed more than just the usual lecture courses. They needed class meetings that would give them a reason to come. So I worked with faculty for an entire week to come up with ways to move forward and make education better for their students. That was March 2020, and we all know what happened next. On March 6th, I believe I was one of the last Americans to leave Brazil on an almost entirely empty flight. On March 9th, the Monday after I returned home, we faculty at Grand Valley were hearing rumors that this new disease, COVID-19, was spreading so fast that campus would be closing and all classes might be moved to online formats. By Wednesday, March 11th, those rumors were verified, and the following Monday, March 16th, we flipped the switch and engaged in what I've been calling the big pivot, converting over 100 sections of mathematics courses, almost none of which were designed to be taught online, and serving thousands of students, almost none of whom had experience taking courses online, to online courses. And all of those issues that I had worked with Escola Politecnica to address, how best to use scarce and valuable class time, how to leverage digital technologies to focus on active learning, these went from important but obscure innovations to urgent issues that are fundamental to the very survival of the university. We all have our stories of the big pivot, what we endured, what we learned, and how we've changed. What I'd like to talk with you about today is a story that I experienced, starting with that week in Sao Paulo, continuing with my home institution during the pandemic year, and still continuing now. It's a story about the rise of online education, not as a fringe approach done by a small and somewhat crazy minority of instructors and institutions, but as a new fundamental platform for teaching and learning that is now with us forever. This is also a story about how flipped learning, which, like online learning, have been done only by a fringe group, is beginning to emerge as the basic operating system for how higher education can and perhaps should be done. My main point today is this. Flipped learning is the ideal platform for the kind of higher education that we will deliver from now on, and it is uniquely situated to address the challenges of online and hybrid learning. Online learning poses a number of important and unique challenges for higher education, and because of this, many have chosen to marginalize or ignore it in the past. But even without COVID, the realities of modern life and the world our students inhabit make online learning impossible to ignore. COVID has merely accelerated its ascent. The universities that crack the code on online learning will thrive for many years to come, and I'm convinced that flipped learning is the key for doing that. Let's first explore the challenges I mentioned, which give my talk part of its title. By online education, I'm really referring to a spectrum of pedagogical and course design choices, all of which are mediated by digital tools and the internet. There's synchronous online instruction, asynchronous online instruction, and various forms of hybrid instruction, which blend in-person and online instruction. Each of these modalities has a different set of pros and cons, but from my vantage point, they all share at least 4 significant challenges to teaching and learning. The challenge of active learning, the challenge of physical environments, the challenge of assessment, and the challenge of human connection. I'm going to speak about each of these challenges in depth. What do I mean by active learning? Well, here is a definition that has been a standard for a while. Active learning is instructional activities involving students in doing things and thinking about what they are doing. This is due to a paper from Bonwell and Eisen back in 1991. Simply put, active learning is any activity aimed at instruction where students are involved in building their own understanding of what they're learning, including reflection on what they've learned. This opens the door for a wide range of activities, from simple think, pair, share to immersive community-based learning projects. That variety is good, but it can make active learning feel unfocused. How do you know when it's happening? How can you measure it? And in particular, is it possible for meaningful active learning to take place in an online environment? There's a newer model of active learning that I think holds a lot of promise, and it comes from a paper from 2021. It's called the Construction of Understanding Ecosystem. And in this model, traditional lecture-based teaching looks like this. Students get exposure to the practices, data, models, and experiences necessary to master a topic, but it all funnels through the teacher first. Now, active learning, on the other hand, looks like this. It's a true ecosystem of understanding. Students get direct access to all the components of learning and then interact with peers, the instructors, and themselves as they make sense of all the connections. To me, this is what active learning looks like and feels like. I think it's important to be clear now that active learning is without question the best option for students, not only in terms of content mastery, but also for building a sense of belonging, for building connections between ideas, and building motivation to study and keep studying. And this isn't just my opinion. Today, go read this paper by a team of researchers that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2014. It is a brief 6-page meta-analysis of 225 previous studies on active learning in the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, in higher education. Among the findings this paper presents, the researchers found that students are 55% less likely to fail a STEM course based on active learning than their counterparts in a traditional lecture course, which translates into millions of US dollars saved in tuition spending from those students. And this is just one of hundreds of research results establishing the superiority of active learning over passive instruction in the STEM disciplines. And yet, even with all that data, the vast majority of instruction, in the US at least, is passive lecturing. And when we pivoted to online instruction in 2020, that proportion increased significantly. And with it, so did student disengagement. My daughter, who is now 16 years old, was taking an algebra class in March 2020. It started at 7:30 in the morning and lasted for an hour. Now, here in Michigan, at that time of the day, at that time of the year, it resembles the North Pole in midwinter. It is dark, it is snowy, and it is freezing cold. And here, my daughter was made to sit through a daily algebra class where the teacher did nothing but read from PowerPoint slides on Zoom. One morning, she came out of her room to my home office and said, "Dad, why are we even having a class at all if all the teacher is going to do is read from slides? Why can't we just record it and put it online?" My daughter grasped what a lot of students experience during that time, that if you focus on lecture-based passive methods, there is simply no compelling reason for a student to be present in a class, especially if it's online. And yet, we wonder why there's been such an increase in apparent-student disengagement during the pandemic. My daughter and all those other students also grasped something positive, that if you focus a class meeting on active learning, then the class meeting becomes not only essential, but desirable. Because not only are you using the class time productively by constructing your understanding, you're also gaining something that was so often lost in the pandemic, social interaction. And I'll say a lot more about that point in a minute. But to be fair, active learning is hard to do online because you are not always physically present with others, possibly not at all, and possibly not even online at the same time. How do you do active learning in such an environment? I think flipped learning provides a very important answer to this question, and it's shockingly simple. Flipped learning makes space for active learning by moving direct instruction from the classroom space to students' individual spaces. One thing we've learned, I think, from COVID is the incalculable value of simply being able to meet together. What a waste, then, to take that hard fought time together and spend it on lecturing. It would be far better to use a class hour like it was the last hour we had on Earth, and we urgently need to engage in constructing understanding of what we are learning. Flipped learning adopts this sense of urgency, the urgency of togetherness, and builds it into pedagogy. What online teaching can learn from flipped learning is that this prioritization of time and space, direct instruction in the student's individual space before class, and then active engagement in class and as a class, isn't limited to in-person instruction. It's actually ideally suited for online instruction, where the online medium for pre-class work is natural and not just bolted onto the class. Simply put, if you want to have more active learning in an online class, then get the direct instruction out of the meetings and reinvest the time you have on active learning. Once you do this, making time for active learning and committing to using it during a class meeting, you begin to discover, like a lot of instructors discovered during the big pivot, that active learning can be done in a variety of settings, and they don't all have to require physical co-location. For example, if you want students to work on a math problem, they do not have to be huddled around a physical desk or a whiteboard in a group. They can instead be working on a collaborative whiteboard, like you see here. This is from a recent online class that I taught at Grand Valley, and connected via a breakout room in Zoom. So the challenge of how to do active learning in a classroom, in the end, is not a challenge that is unique to online teaching. It merely requires some creativity and technical skill to do it online. But fundamentally, the problem is just how to make time for it. And flipped learning leads the way on that. Another challenge for online education is the physical environment, and specifically, in many cases, the lack of a physical environment. How do we engage in good teaching and learning if we can no longer assume that we are sitting in the same room? It's actually more complicated than that. One of the models of instruction we saw during the pandemic was a particular form of hybrid instruction, where in order to implement social distancing in the classroom, a portion of the class is present on one day while the rest of the class is online, zooming into the class meeting. And then on another day, the in-person group becomes the online group and vice versa. One of the classes I taught in fall 2020 was set up like this. It's a particular flavor of a technique known as high flex, short for hybrid flexible, where a class is conducted both in person and online simultaneously, and students choose which modality to use, in some instances on a daily basis. Even without high flex officially in place at your university, from now on, you may need to accommodate a student who is too sick to attend class physically by providing an equivalent online option. Because of the pandemic, we can no longer assume that you and your students will be co-located in a physical classroom, or even that you will have a room at all. Flipped learning, again, can give us some answers to this issue. Flipped learning, first of all, does not assume physical co-location. It only assumes that students are getting first contact with new ideas through a structured activity prior to any initial group meeting. So in fact, flipped learning intentionally de-emphasizes co-location. It takes the activity traditionally given pride of place in instruction, the in-person lecture, and deliberately makes it independent of location, accessible to students in any location or on any device they choose. This is one of the reasons I've advocated for moving away from the term flipped classroom, because there's not necessarily a classroom involved in flipped learning. Flipped learning also makes no assumptions about the group space that follows pre-class work. We traditionally think of this as a class meeting, but even if it is a meeting, there is nothing that says this can't be a synchronous online meeting, like a Zoom call, or even an asynchronous discussion done in a group. The only thing that matters from flipped learning standpoint is that the group space is purposefully focused on active learning on higher order tasks. And that, as we've seen, can be done online. In fact, the tools for doing this are better than they've ever been, and creative faculty everywhere have been using them to great effect. So if an online instructor is struggling to cope with the fact that there is no physical space for their class, the instructor can look to flipped learning as a model. And in the cases where there is a physical classroom available and we have in-person meetings, the focus of flipped learning on using that space for active learning tasks is more critical now than ever. As I mentioned earlier, we have fought hard to be able to meet with students in physical spaces, and we felt the loss of that ability during the pandemic. Don't waste that on lecturing. Use the affordances of your physical space to promote active learning. And if possible, consider an upgrade to an active learning space like this one at my university, where active learning is a first-class citizen. The next challenge of online learning is one that you hear quite frequently when talking with instructors, namely that it's hard to assess students in online classes. In a traditional in-person class, assessment typically looks like one thing, a quiz or an exam done under direct observation of a proctor within the bounds of a time and physical location. Online classes, whether synchronous or asynchronous, remove at least two of those three constraints, if not all three. You might give a time test in an online class, but there's no proctor and no limitations on where a person might get resources. Yes, you can get online proctoring software, but it is expensive, and ultimately any sufficiently motivated student can defeat it. Or you can require that students take tests in a physical testing center, but this defeats the purpose of having the class online in the first place. In some cases, may not even be possible. Questions about the fairness and logistics of timed, proctored, co-located testing were being raised even before COVID, but the pandemic turned those questions into everyday realities. After 2 years of trying to port this model of testing into online and hybrid instruction, it's time to admit that it just doesn't work. We might as well face up to the fact that traditional assessment models and online learning don't mix. And since online modalities are rapidly becoming a default option, and traditional testing already occupies a default position, we need to realize that one of these must go. Now, in fact, the idea that online courses are ripe with cheating and dishonesty is largely a myth. This paper, for example, shows that academic dishonesty in online courses is no more common than academic dishonesty in in-person courses. What it suggests is that cheating is not a problem with the modality of a course, it's a problem with the kind of assessments we give. If we give timed high-stakes assessments that are primarily focused at low-level cognitive tasks like recall and understanding, it's asking for problems, no matter what the modality of the class. Information recall questions can be answered by internet searches, and basic understanding questions have answers that all look alike. Either way, it's impossible to know without expensive, invasive, and ineffective proctoring software to know if a person's work is really theirs. Even if a student doesn't cheat on such a question, is the work really theirs, or are they merely mimicking what they've seen and heard? I truly believe that in a digital connected world, we can no longer use assessments targeting the bottom one-third of Bloom's taxonomy as a viable source of information about student learning or contributors to a student's course grade. That is, you can assess those low-level skills all you want. However, trust but verify, as they say, by also assessing the middle and top third of Bloom. And it's from here that you can really tell what a person knows or doesn't know. The devaluing of low-level but high-stakes assessment poses a serious problem not to online education itself, but to the idea that online education can be done by simply transplanting in-person courses to a Zoom meeting. Instead, online education requires a refocusing of assessments to tasks that focus on application, analysis, and creativity. We sometimes call these authentic assessments because they have a greater fidelity to what actual people do in their jobs and are more like real human inquiry than low-level assessments. Now, how on earth are we supposed to make this shift? Once again, flipped learning leads the way on this. In flipped learning, we don't just move lecturing outside the group space, we reinvest the time that's freed up by doing active learning. But active learning on what tasks? Well, it's on these very middle third of Bloom's taxonomy tasks that we're talking about here. Flipped learning stakes its reputation on focusing on authentic, real-world tasks that apply basic information and in some ways de-emphasizing their remember and understand levels of Bloom. These are still important and we value them, But we value the middle third more than the bottom third, and it shows in the way that flipped learning allocates time and space to give those tasks pride of place. A final challenge to online education is perhaps the hardest and most critical of all, and that's the challenge of making, maintaining, and growing relationships with other human beings. Self-determination theory from psychology tells us that people need three things to become fully motivated and engaged in a task: autonomy, competence, and connectedness. We need to know that we are growing in our skills, that we are doing so because of our own actions, and importantly, that we are not doing it alone. Perhaps the disconnection and disengagement that many report among students today is not some moral defect in their generation, but it's the natural outcome of having a life that is disconnected from others. If that's the case, then does online learning make this better or worse? Online learning is sometimes blamed for being cold and impersonal, and this is often justified. But it is also very much the case that in-person learning suffers from the same isolation and dehumanization. Just walk into any typical university class. How much socialization is happening? How much collaboration? How much interaction? Sharing a classroom where we all sit together in silence to stare at a lecturer and a PowerPoint deck is not socialization. You can call it in-person instruction if you want, but the fact is that there may as well be no human persons in the room if we keep with the pedagogy that most universities currently use as the default. And just as with assessment, if we try to port that approach to in-person learning into the online space, we're going to get the same level of disconnection you find in those large lecture courses. This shouldn't surprise us, and it's not a problem of the modality of the course. It's a problem rooted in the approach to pedagogy. You certainly can have meaningful human relationships through an online medium. Just look at what we're doing right now with this Congress, for example. Or, as another good example, look at the Slack workspace that I administer for college instructors interested in alternative grading practices. Or your Twitter network. It's all a matter of intent and how much work you put into it. And that's true for all human relationships. So how does online learning become a rich source of human connection? You can probably guess what I'm going to say. Flipped learning gives us a great model, because flipped learning repurposes class time not just for active learning and practice with higher level cognitive skills. It does so in a specifically social context. It brings students together in class to become more than just a room full of people. It's a community of learners all striving to reach those higher cognitive levels together, where we can do each other the most good. Flipped learning is a pedagogy based on social interaction, and that's because flipped learning is a vehicle for active learning, and active learning is inherently social. Remember the construction of understanding ecosystem model we talked about earlier. Here, in a true active learning environment, all the ingredients needed for learning are available to students. It does not filter through the instructor first, and it is not based on a scarcity model that says information, models, and experiences are not and perhaps should not be accessible to students, maybe because we think students aren't smart enough to know what to do with them. Active learning instead is an ecosystem of understanding where students are given direct access to all the information and tools they need to learn. Although nobody is giving access to students because they already have it through the internet. And crucially, down here, learning takes place by students interacting with information and tools, but not only that, but with each other, with the instructors, and with themselves through reflection. This is the active learning that flipped learning was created to give as often as possible and to as many students as possible. Flipped learning done right is almost overwhelmingly rich in social interaction and human connection. Online learning can be leveraged using flipped learning's blueprint to do exactly the same. We have the tools and the technology to do it, but do we have the will? So in conclusion, what I've been arguing in this talk is that while online learning faces numerous real challenges, these are not challenges without potential solutions, and flipped learning provides a blueprint and some clues for how to address those challenges. Doing active learning in an online course is challenging. Flipped learning shows how it can be done by a mindful remixing of which tasks are done in which space. Decoupling learning activities from physical space is a challenge for online learning, and again, flipped learning shows how this can be done by leveraging digital media to handle much of the work we currently do with and in those spaces. Assessing student learning in a valid and trustworthy way is an ongoing challenge for online learning, and flipped learning teaches us that the best way to address this problem isn't to create a police surveillance state in our classes, but to shift our assessments to something more real and authentic, and it uses class time to bring those to life. And finally, building human relationships that allow students to flourish is a challenge for online learning, but we realize it's a challenge in any kind of learning situation. And indeed, this is the primary challenge of life itself. No particular pedagogical choice is going to solve this problem for us. It's about how we use the time and the tools we have to be intentional about building relationships. However, we see that some pedagogical choices are more naturally aligned with those intentions than others, and in particular, once again, flipped learning models the way forward by taking class time and saying, this time is for you, students, to become a community of learners together. Online learning is not going away. Indeed, the survival of our institutions is inextricably linked to our willingness to take online education seriously. We ignore it or dismiss it at our great peril. But engaging with online education by simply taking ineffective in-person pedagogies, or even effective ones, and transplanting them in whole cloth to an online environment is not going to work. We need a platform, not just a software or hardware platform for implementing online instruction, but a pedagogical platform for our teaching and learning. Some kind of pedagogical operating system on which all of our apps for active learning will run. Flipped learning is that operating system. Flipped learning itself is not really a teaching method, it's an environment in which various teaching methods happen, and that environment is location agnostic, uses technology in productive ways, gives pride of place to active learning, so we're using synchronous time as productively as possible, and helps build human-to-human relationships regardless of modality. If this sounds like a great way to move forward with online learning too, then I think we're on the right track.